exploration of the human mind. The task, first of all, well, the task is consumers are crucial in the fight against climate change. And when it comes to the promotion of sustainable consumption, we need to be able to read the minds of the consumer. We therefore need to understand their motives and intentions, assess how likely they are to change their pattern of consumption, and decide whether they can break long-established habits and routines. Now, this mind reading might seem to be very difficult, but an extraordinary number of influential people and organizations think it's indeed possible. Now, I'm going to argue very quickly that it's more difficult than it might appear because consumers don't have a mind. They have two. They've got two distinct subsystems, each with its own properties and mode of operation. So here's some mind reading. I could have picked 1,000,001 examples, but here's some by DEFRA. I gather there's one representative of DEFRA here today. So, DEFRA have based their sustainable consumption strategy on people's ability to act, which of course depends upon external constraints and people's willingness to act. And DEFRA argue very sensibly and very appropriately that we need to take both things into account. Are people in a position to change? And that depends often on their economic situation, where they live and so on, but also their willingness to act. And here's a quote: "Many people are willing to do a bit more to limit their environmental impact, yet people have a much lower level of understanding about what they can do and what would make a difference." So what they're doing is they're reading the mind of the consumer. They're saying they are willing to act, and we know and we can tell that this is what they're prepared to do. Now, of course, that's backed up by numerous surveys of pro-environmental attitudes, in which people seem to agree that if there's no change in the world, we'll soon experience a major crisis. And nearly 80% of people say that they are prepared to change their behavior. So again, the mind reading's backed up with people reporting what they say they are quite prepared to do. Now, of course, what underpins all of this is that people are trying to assess people's attitudes. And by attitudes, classically in psychology, we mean a mental and neural state of readiness organized through experience, exerting a directive or dynamic influence upon the individual's response. So when we're mind reading people, what we're trying to do is we're trying to assess their attitude and what their behavior is likely to be as a consequence of their attitude. And Allport was probably the most famous psychologist who there were a number working simultaneously, but he was the one who most contemporary views kind of based on his perspective. And what was interesting about Allport was that it was him who pioneered this notion of the self-report of the attitude. Even though it's a mental and neural state of readiness, Allport said, well, if you ask people, they generally speaking can report what they're planning to do next. And if you assess attitudes in the environmental domain, this is one little experiment we did into attitudes to low carbon, generally speaking, you get something that looks pretty positive. A Likert score is a simple score from 1 to 5, indicating how pro you are something. A 5 here means pro. Oops, it's not shining on the screen. 5 means very pro-low carbon. Most people you can see are shifted towards the 4 and 5 end. Most people express very pro-low carbon attitudes. Very few people are down this end of the scale. And that's in keeping with almost every other survey that's ever been done. But what's interesting is Allport also said that often an attitude seems to have no representation in consciousness other than a vague sense of need, or some indefinite or unanalyzable feeling of doubt, assent, conviction, effort, or familiarity. And this was the psychologist who said, let's just ask people what their attitude is, what they're prepared to do, what they think they're going to do next. Now the question is, can we build a science and effective policy on these vague senses and unanalyzable feelings of doubt, but nevertheless which may be crucial for the prediction of behavior? Now that's the challenge. Now what's interesting is that one advance is the recognition within psychology that there are two subsystems in the brain, and we know, and this is the critical bit, we now have ways of investigating these. So, and if you want to kind of trace the intellectual origins of that, I think it comes from two quite different sources. One source is the kind of social psychology of someone like Anthony Greenwald, who talks about implicit cognitions, and the notion that traces of past experience affect behavior, even though that past experience is not remembered. So the idea is that there are all kinds of unconscious influences on behavior, and even though we're not aware of them, they impact on our behavior. And then, of course, the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman has talked about System 1 and System 2. And System 1 responses are the kind of responses that occur in everyday life in which there doesn't appear to be any conscious deliberation or thinking. We just do something and we're not aware of doing it. One very simple example of that is the way we automatically analyze someone's emotion and anticipate their response. System 2 is the conscious reflective system where we allocate attention to mental activities. So the idea is that there are two quite separate systems. One's conscious control, reflective, intentional, and slow. That's system 2. And one's unconscious, automatic, impulsive, unintended, and fast. Two quite separate systems. Now, what's really interesting about psychology now is that I think we've got a way into these systems. We've got a way of measuring them. And one of the tests that we use, I do a lot of work on implicit processing generally, but one very simple test is called the implicit association test, which is a computerized classification test. You don't say anything, you just press buttons. And it looks at how quickly you can associate certain things, for example, low and high carbon footprint products, with concepts of good and bad. And the idea is that it's harder to associate certain categories of things than others. So if people are very pro-low carbon, they find it very easy to associate that with the word good. Now what's interesting, if you take this measurement and then look at its predictive validity, sometimes what people tell you does predict their behavior in some situations, but sometimes it doesn't. And the IAT, the implicit measure, is very predictive under certain circumstances. If people are under any cognitive or emotional load or under any kind of time pressure. But interestingly, it's also a very good predictor in sensitive domains where self-reports are likely to be biased. So implicit attitudes to carbon footprint, one of our first studies was measuring that. So what do we know so far based on this new carbon IAT of ours? Well, we don't know what the implicit attitude is in the population as a whole. One chap in the coffee said, what size are the samples? Are we talking about hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands? No, psychology studies, we're talking about hundreds. But we have an online version, so we could do the whole population if we wanted now. What we do know is that there is no significant correlation with self-reported attitudes. In every sample we do, when we do the measure of implicit attitude, it never correlates with the measure of explicit attitude. So the two things seem to be dissociated. And there are many surface screens who explicitly say one thing, but their implicit attitude is at odds with this, surface screens. So here's a surface screen. Now, we've measured this student. She's obviously a student. We've measured her explicit attitude, very pro-low carbon. We've measured her implicit attitude. She's not pro-low carbon. She doesn't know this, okay? She doesn't know this. It's not that she's just trying to be nice to me. She doesn't know. I have done hundreds and hundreds of these tests now, and most people don't know how they're going to come out. They're as shocked as I am. And what she's talking about is she's talking about consumer choice. And what she's saying, if two products were next to each other, and it was quite obvious that one was good, meaning low carbon, and one was bad, then you'd go for the good one. So imagine her in a focus group or in any kind of survey of attitudes. She would come out as being very green, choosing the low carbon. Now, as Alistair said, I do analyse nonverbal communication sometimes for a living, and all of us can analyse this student's nonverbal communication because it's very telling. Now, she is dissociated. Her explicit attitude is one way, her implicit attitude is another. Watch her behaviour.
They were next to each other, and it was quite obvious one was good and one was bad, then you'd go for the good one.
You'd go for the good one, sorry. She was using the gestural space. When we locate things in gestural space, we keep them consistently. If you put low carbon there, high carbon there, they stay there. They don't move all over the place. And this kind of weird gesture-speech mismatch, we didn't find a single example when people's underlying attitude was congruent with their explicit attitude, not one. So this kind of thing is quite strange. Only emerged with a dissociative group. Now, is it surprising? Well, we probably do care about the environment when we think consciously and carefully about it. And yet, for years, we've been socialized to think and feel differently. Now, here's a little film I asked a couple of my research assistants to make for me. This is why she is the way she is. It looks as if many people end up dissociated, wanting to do something about the environment, seeming to care in terms of self-reported attitude, their implicit attitude quite at odds. One little experiment we did was when we were measuring IAT, we sometimes give students money. We thought it'd be nice to give them a little present instead. We offered them either a high carbon or a low carbon present. We just measured their explicit attitudes. We measured their implicit attitude. And we were just interested in just noting which they wanted. And interestingly, the implicit attitude predicted even the choice of the goodie bag before they left, not the explicit attitude. Now, the implications of this, well, what are the implications? Well, could we develop a model for different people? Because it's often been pointed out that different people act for different reasons, and motivation for one may well be a barrier for another. And how do we communicate and interact with people in the most effective way to support more sustainable lifestyles. Now, of course, the way most people, most organizations and most agencies think about this is, let's think about a segmentation analysis. And the segmentation analysis is based, of course, upon self-reported attitudes, maybe fragments of behavior. And the idea is to then tie it into socioeconomic groups, plus the kinds of media that people might consume within different groups if we were thinking about influence. So, for example, DEFRA's, here's one of their groups, Positive Greens, estimated 18%, 7.6 million. Again, based on self-reports, the group assesses themselves as acting in more environmentally friendly ways. They consistently hold beliefs, blah, blah, blah. As opposed to sideline supporters, 14%, generally pro-environmental worldview, although beliefs held relatively weakly, are willing to learn, do more, etc., etc. Now, the question is, could we do something different, recognizing that there are two different kind of pushes and pulls within each individual, that there are explicit attitudes which may impact on behavior, but only in some situations, but there's something else there as well. So we've now, at the SDI, developed an online carbon IAT, which could be done with huge populations to measure implicit attitude, and of course that could be combined with the normal attitude measures for explicit attitudes. And then we could segment by these two dimensions. And each quadrant in those dimensions presents quite different challenges. So, for example, if the explicit attitude is positive and the implicit is positive, they're true greens. If it's the explicit is positive and the implicit is negative, they're surface greens, like the person we've just seen. You could have the reverse, which is someone explicitly negative, i.e. thinks it's all too difficult, but they're implicitly positive, they're hidden greens, and then implicit would be non-greens. Now, it just seems to me that for each of those groups, in order to persuade them to adopt more sustainable lifestyles, the challenge is really, really quite different. And we can talk about that, I'm sure, in the discussion. So that's one thing. We could do a segmentation analysis based on this. The second kind of thing we can do is we can think quite seriously about this whole business of engineering System 1 responses to carbon labels. A few years ago, I did some work eye tracking, people looking at products, and we were interested in the frame-by-frame analysis of where they looked, 25 times a second. And of course, they do look at carbon labels some of the time, but getting onto the carbon label usually takes them about 6 seconds to get onto it. And only in 7% of all cases do they look first at the carbon footprint icon or information. And that seems to be different for GDA information, in which people seem much more interested, particularly if people have got values associated with health and fitness. 71% look at calories, 61% at fat. And if you do a little hotspot analysis of chocolate eggs, there's a lot of fixation on the GDA information, of course, but kind of less on the footprint information. So the question is, how can we go about engineering this System 1 response, this more emotional response to carbon label, carbon footprint? And why the difference? Well, because calories, fat content means something emotionally. And of course, if something impacts emotionally, it's good for immediate responses. We need people to give us an emotional response, a System 1 response to these kind of things. Carbon footprint might be interesting, but doesn't engage in the same way. And of course, another thing we can start thinking about, if we think about this System 1, System 2 analysis, is turning System 1 responses into System 2 responses. We may need to persuade people that everyday shopping needs more current time so that System 2 can take over. And of course, elsewhere in the behavioral change literature, and I'm thinking about exercise and eating and so on, people have used implementation intentions as a way of breaking routine habits. So implementation intentions are it's an attempt to introduce goal-directed behavior in certain situations. For example, if I'm looking for fruit, then I will look for local seasonal fruit to break habits. So the idea is that I think from elsewhere in psychology, we know that there are techniques you can use for inducing change depending upon the specific combination of System 1 and System 2 responses. And what I'm saying is that this is a way of moving forward which kind of recognizes that human beings have several different layers to them. It's not surprising why we've got these layers to us, but I think serious attempts to change consumer behavior have to start with that recognition.